Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Welcome back to The Curious Collector. This is Stuart Holbrook with you for episode 42. And I am coming to you, as I usually do, from somewhere out in the world of doll collecting and collectors. And in this particular case, I'm in Big D. That's Dallas, Texas, for those of you who don't know. You're working on a few collections and meeting some interesting collectors that I know, because this is a hotbed, I will tell you. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area has some of the biggest doll clubs in America and a number of enthusiastic and wonderful collectors. It's a great place to come, and always enjoy being here in Big D. And then I'll be moving on to Wichita, Billings, Montana, Spokane, Washington, Seattle, flying back for the Maryland Dornbush. I got a busy couple weeks, but I'm going to be coming to you with some more podcasts as I can drop them. If you can keep up with me, I don't know. Tammy, can you keep up with me?
It's very difficult. I never know where you are.
I do get that often anxiety attack sometimes in the mornings when I'll wake up at like 4 a.m. and I will have that, where the heck am I?
I bet.
And you're trying to figure out where you are at this particular case. So it happens quite a bit. You know, a lot of people don't know I'm on the road 250 to 300 days a year all over the world. So it can be wild sometimes, but I always know you're there in the studio in Los Angeles, ready to record a podcast from whatever hotel I'm coming from.
I never seem to go anywhere except this studio. So I'm always right here.
I know. We were talking earlier, and I'm suffering from spring allergies right now. My eyes are burning and everything. And you're in California. You really don't get it like we do. And I told you about green on the cars, and you were like, what?
Yeah, I'd never heard of that in the world. Tell everybody else.
Which shocked me. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's literally every morning you'll come out, your car is green.
Green.
Black car, it's now green.
Oh my
and
gosh.
You have to go to the car wash and get it all off. It gets inside the car. It's everywhere.
And this is pollen.
So it's pollen.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pollen.
Well,
so,
I have a solution for that. You buy a green car. Then nobody would know.
Okay, well, yeah, but that doesn't get rid of the pollen.
No.
It's still your allergies. I mean, that's great advice. All right.
Hey, I tried.
Okay, thanks. Well, let's get on with this and talk about today's particular episode, which I felt really countered well with our previous episode 41 that was about community and collecting. And if you haven't listened to that one yet, it's probably a good idea to go back, listen to that first, and then come into this one, because I think it's a yin and yang approach to the different ideals and different formats that collectors can use during their, let's call it, collecting career. While I was touting in the previous podcast about the joys of developing community through collecting, we have to accept and face that many collectors choose a different path. There are many collectors that choose a quiet approach, very private approach to building their collections over their lifetime. They don't necessarily make a lot of collector friends, if any. They do not socialize in collecting circles. They aren't really on social media, maybe perhaps lurking in the backwaters and watching, but they're not actually socializing on social media. And so they may even have a very, very tight circle of one particular dealer they deal with or one auction house they bid with. I can tell you a very significant percentage of our buyers today I have never met or ever even talked to. Can you believe that? They come in, they bid, they pay, the dolls are shipped to them, and that is it. Some I've tried to communicate with, sent a nice email, and occasionally they'll send a nice thank you very much, I appreciate it, or sometimes no response at all. So there can be a whole league of these, I call them the quiet collectors out there across the world. We think of that. A lot of collectors say, oh, well, that tends to be kind of the European approach. They tend to be more private with their collecting. And yes, that's true. Historically, Europeans have been very, very private in their approach. But this is everywhere. It is in Asia. It is all over the United States. And we'll talk about that today and talk about what is behind the quiet collector? Why do they choose this? Sometimes it's by necessity. Maybe it's geography. Sometimes it's for other particular reasons that they have that are personal. And we'll kind of address this to understand a little bit that there are actually a few advantages to quiet collecting, but there are disadvantages as well. I don't think this is a podcast that's there for you to say, well, this will help me now. What one will I choose? Will I choose community or will I choose privacy? I don't think it's like that. I think you do choose naturally. It's just who you are as a person will bring you into the path of developing a large community and socializing through your hobby or taking a more personal route. So who are these quiet collectors? And that's the burning question that everybody has, especially those who socialize and can't imagine, how could you collect so privately? So you ask, who are they? Well, you don't know. You don't know typically until the end. And that's when the collections tend to come out on the marketplace and we learn about these intriguing people. And that's what my career has always been so amazing in every day. And I was talking to Tammy earlier about this and how I wake up in a different city all the time. And what I love about my job is I never really know what the day is going to hold. What kind of a collection will I walk into? What kind of a collector will I meet? And it's really a fascinating part of my work to be able to have these constant mysteries that I may walk into a home one day and uncover a collection that was never known. I want you to kind of think about this and imagine it because I have an example of this, of a quiet collector and walking into that home. And I think it helps put things into context for you to understand who they are. And the fact is, it can be anywhere. These quiet collectors could be sheltering in some of the smallest towns. They could be your next door neighbor. They could be just down the street. They're everywhere and you don't know about them. And I think that's one of the really compelling parts of collecting is imagining all of these mysteries that are out there and could be right around the corner from you. One of my favorite books over the years, and one of my favorite writers as well, is the famed Texas writer Larry McMurtry, who many of you probably remember him from writing Lonesome Dove that was made into the series. And he wrote a book in the 1970s and was called Cadillac Jack. And I identified with this book just more so for my own career, even reading it years and years later. I've read it in, I believe, the 90s and again in the 2000s, and it still felt very poignant to me, even though it had become an older book. But it told the story of this antique dealer. His nickname was Cadillac Jack. And he drove a big Cadillac and he traveled around the country dealing in rare and interesting objects. And it's a wonderful read if you ever want to pick this up. But as a collector, everyone should read this book. There's some interesting insights. And Larry McMurtry, he wrote this from the concept of being a collector because he was a absolutely amazing collector of rare books. He even had a bookshop. Even though he's one of the most famed writers in America, he had a bookstore in a small town in Texas. And I remember going there some years ago and he was in the store, just sitting there behind his books and talking to people as they came in. So quite a character. But I digress. To the point of this book, there was a quote in there that I always remember and has absolutely held true throughout my career. Anything can be anywhere. It's so true. So let me take you to this story in this moment in my career, which I think highlights this particular instance. So I got a call, I don't know, it was, I think about 12 years ago, 13 years ago, of a collection in East Texas in a small town. And I was going to Dallas in the next week. So coincidentally where I am now. So I decided, I'll run over there and look at it. Now, I know you think, well, everybody can just send pictures nowadays, right, of the collection, but it doesn't always hold true to the capabilities of that person, or many of the families are dealing with collections that were put into storage, or everything is just in a room and it's impossible to even get in there to be able to take photos of pieces. So they just say, look, here's what we have. There's a lot of dolls, literally 1,000 dolls here in this house. Could you see it? And I would say, okay, if you lived in Japan, I'm going to definitely say we've got to have photos. But I'm going to be in Dallas. I can run over to East Texas. It was an hour and a half, 2-hour drive from Dallas. So I went over. I pulled up in front of this little ranch home that the lawn was all overgrown. it looked like there could never be much of anything there. I walked into the house, and lo and behold, there was one of the most amazing collections of my career. I think a total in the end was something like 1.5 million, including in that collection, the Rochard that set the world record and still stands as a world record for a doll at 335,000 and now sits in the Barry Art Museum. Anything can be anywhere. Nobody knew about this collection. This collector who primarily bought in the 1960s and early 1970s. She was very quiet, very private. She had a few people that she worked with, typically out of New York, that she would get things from back in the day, but they were long gone. And she lived on with her dolls. She stopped collecting in the 70s and just lived with her collection for another, 45 years or so, and eventually passed away. And the family said, we don't know what's here. We don't know what this is. And this was the true consummate quiet collector. No one knew in this little ranch house in East Texas, there was a multi-million-dollar doll collection sitting in there that you drove by this house, you would never imagine it. So this always intrigued me. What drives someone to build something so extraordinary and then share it with no one their entire lives? And for those of you who are social and like the connections and love the community, it's very hard to fathom. You're left shaking your head and you almost think it's sad. But for them, it's not. They just chose a different way and a different path. So let's talk about what's the psychology behind this. And these people that I have met privately who have allowed me an opportunity to come into their inner world and talk with them, even though they are very private, and those that I have learned about afterwards from their family and what was the motivation behind this. And I think it will help you see that there's not anything sad about this. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just a different way than community and socializing through your collection. So again, what makes someone choose solitude in a hobby? A hobby that you often associate with community and with sharing and with the validation so many collectors want in their collecting and crave so often. I've talked about this a number of times in the past, that collecting is, and your collection is, an extension really of you. It is an extension of your taste and your values and your lives. And I often quote Mrs. Cameron in Colorado Springs, who years ago really changed my life and my perspective in understanding the heart of a collector, when we were going to be taking her collection. And she was crying and she looked at me and said, when the dolls are gone, who will I be? And so I realized then at that point, and I very much understand it now, and I think all of you who truly are collectors realize this in yourself, that these are an extension of yourself. They are part of you. So with that, you have people who obviously are in the social aspect of collecting. They like to share this and they like to share that extension of themselves. But then there are some people who are deeply private in their own life and their collections are deeply personal to them. I often like to think that these collectors, their collection, it's like a secret garden. And it's their garden, and they want to have it to themselves. They want to enjoy it without any input or any outside intrusion into this secret world that they built. And I almost think that's kind of a beautiful thing in a lot of ways. And so I think that's the first prominent reason I've often found that you have collectors who are deeply private. So with that, let's understand that, again, in talking about the two different types of collectors, we can dig more in understanding each of their values and relationships with collecting, and will help us understand the private collectors, in that collectors who socialize, collectors who believe in community, collectors who are out there meeting everyone they can meet. Collecting is almost like a performance, and they are on the stage with their collection, sharing it with the world, and they enjoy that part of it. And that's a wonderful thing. And it makes for a really fun lifetime in the hobby if you're of that personality. But if you are a quiet collector, if you are more private, collecting can be beautiful as well as a very, very intimate let's call it communion with objects. Now, with that said, it's not as if there is one underlying factor, one commonality between all quiet collectors that created this approach that may be different, very different in some cases, than the more social collectors. There could be a number of different factors. It could be a combination of factors. And I want to go through these a little bit with you so you can understand the different reasons why some people may choose this in their collecting lives. So the first is, of course, some just prefer to have a refuge from the noise of their lives within collecting. That is, collecting for them, as we've talked about already, is a very silent endeavor. They appreciate that quietness. They respect that communion, as we've talked about, with their dolls, and they really don't want outside noise. They just want it to be a quiet respite, like we talked about, that secret garden. But then we get into some of the practical reasons, and I think we tend not to realize that sometimes the underlying factor is the most common thing you never even thought of. How about a lot of these people are just really busy? There's a lot of clients we have that have insanely busy careers. They have family. They have other interests as well that they just have no time to address what you may enjoy, the social aspect of collecting. Now, a lot of you may say, well, I'm busy, but I still go to doll clubs. I still go out to the auctions and the shows, and I like to go to the conventions, and I like having a lot of friends and dolls. I can balance that. That's fine. That may be you. Some people can multitask better than others. But there are a lot of people, they may have a $200 million a year company. They're working 12, 13-hour days every day, and they just don't have any room to fit anything else in. They've got to stay focused, but they still love the collecting. If anything, these are the ones who need that collecting more than most, because when they come home, sometimes exhausted, or they have family, they have 3 children, going into that special room, that secret garden we've talked about, is a release for them. It's a personal space. It's a personal joy that they have built, that they can enter into this almost fantasy through their collection. And that is, I can see, therapeutic for a lot of people who are very busy. Now, obviously, the next reason is there are just naturally more introverted people in the world today. People that just don't socialize really as much as maybe you do. And they may look at socializing in the same way that you look at introversion. And that is that they don't understand it. You don't understand it, but that's okay. You have to respect this and understand that some people are. Now, I think it's also important to address the fact that I believe, and I've seen over the years, that society is becoming more introverted in many ways. And I think a lot of this is an adjunct to social media. It has created 2 different schools of thought with the way people interact in the world. And the one is, I have social media, I can interact there. I don't need to go out to restaurants or doll clubs or anything like that. So there's a level of introversion, though they may be very social online. There's an introverted aspect of them that they prefer it to be online. And then there are many who are introverted in all facets of this approach to social collecting, in the sense that they don't like social media. They hate that any idea of them is out there living on the internet, and they recoil from all of that. And I can see that is developing more and more, that people are frustrated and fed up with social media, and they pull back even more from the social aspects of it, because it seems to always involve something related to social media. If you get together with friends at a restaurant, everybody's taking pictures and wanting to post it on Instagram and all of these things. And there are people that just really don't like that. And I respect this, and I definitely can understand it. So for them, it's very natural as an introverted person to begin to lean into quiet collecting. They still are passionate. They still love the objects. They still want to collect, and they're not completely introverted. I mean, clearly, if you're going to collect, you have to have some level of socialization. You still have to bid at auctions. You still have to know a few dealers and talk to them. You can't just quietly go out at 2 a.m. and hunt around the streets looking for a doll. You've got to have some level of communication. So don't think it's like they're totally shut in their homes and never talk to anybody. It's not like that. They're just very, very private from a social sense. And about introversion and the movement and trend we're seeing more in society. This really was predicted years ago by, and I've mentioned her on my podcast before because I've been fascinated with the futurist Faith Popcorn and have read a lot of her studies and work and brilliant futurist. And she actually in the early 2000s predicted this generational shift and coined the term. And again, I've addressed this earlier in podcasts. So if you've already heard this, just go with it. But if you haven't, she coined the term cocooning, that people were going to become more naturally connected to their homes in a way that she predicted in 40 or 50 years would even need to leave home, that every single thing in your life could be created and controlled within your house. And that this would actually create more introverted people in society and less socializing. And it was interesting because she said, now, at the time, she wrote this in the early 2000s. I forget the exact year. She predicted 40 to 50 years. But she actually did say that if there did occur at some point a black swan event that would completely change society overnight, that could be accelerated to an even quicker pace. She never had the idea that COVID would hit. And yet there it is. And that I absolutely believe created a little bit more of an acceleration into this path of cocooning, this path of introversion. And that's why they choose to collect like that. It's just who they are. There are some people out there who are quiet collectors, who are social, but they do it more with a careful approach. That is, I like to call them the hybrid collectors. So hybrid in the sense of they go to doll shows, they go to doll auctions, they might even go to doll conventions. I know some that even belong to clubs, but they're very guarded in the aspect of how they interact with the people there. They typically hold a very tight circle that's built over years of very carefully curated interactions. So they'll have friends over to their home, but they're typically, I often find the same 3 or 4 friends that they've developed in this curated approach that will come to their house and work with them on their collection, talk dolls, and maybe go to doll shows or conventions together, but stay very, very tight in that group. They're very protective of each other and very protective of their mutual privacy. So you will find that occur as well. So another reason, again, very practical, that you might tend to forget, but there are a lot of collectors who have very high profile names. They are celebrities, and there is an essence within the need to maintain anonymity even. It's not so much that they are introverted. It may be that they don't really want to collect privately. They would love to be social, but society has put so much pressure on them that they can't. Every single thing they do is being critiqued, is being talked about, especially in the age of social media. So they prefer this collecting to be very private and have their names never used. I have had many of these high-profile collectors, celebrities out there. Many of them I know, but of course it's kept confidential. And, we're never able to repeat their names. In some cases, NDAs are even signed. And then there are some that I don't even know who it is. I'm dealing with a personal assistant or I'm dealing with a personal curator. Many of them have their own curators of their collections that do all the documentation, display, everything, keeping track of everything coming in, going out, just like in a small museum. And so you deal with them and you really never even speak to or talk to that actual high profile person or a celebrity. And I totally get this. The pressures on their lives are absolutely incredible these days. And I can tell that they want to maintain that level of privacy and not having to talk to a dealer or an auctioneer or anybody. Let their personal assistant do it. Let them work through back and forth the communication between one party to the next without getting involved in it emotionally or being hounded later on. So this, again, turns out to be one of the most practical ones that people probably don't often think about when you're wondering, who is that person who just bought 10 of the dolls I wanted online? And the likelihood is it could be a celebrity that you know from movies or singers or politicians or just a high-profile corporate world person. But you're never really going to know. You're never going to find out because they choose to keep that anonymity. And that is a really practical, as I said, important reason why you have a lot of quiet collectors. And again, I don't know if that's by choice in the sense that they might be social, but they have to choose this path to protect themselves. And you have to respect that. And remember, too, you often think, oh, well, they're celebrities or high profile. They don't love the object as much as us because they don't share. No, these quiet collectors love these pieces and they bring joy to their lives just as much as they do to the social person. They just don't need that part of it, or they can't have that part of it. But they are just as joyful, just as satisfied, and have this connection to the pieces the same as you do. They just go about the process differently, and they go about their collecting life differently. And so the last one is the most practical reason why somebody chooses to be a quiet collector. And I've seen this over the years. Geography. It's just simply, they live in a place where there is no other collector anywhere. And I have an example of this because I've talked about him before, but Benji, the famous collector in the Philippines, who's been a long, enthusiastic collector of very, very fine dolls. And you've heard me talk about him in previous podcasts and give some of the wonderful, unique stories behind Benji over the years. But Benji's in the Philippines, and he literally is, I can tell you, I'm sure there's some other collectors here and there in the Philippines. It's fragmented. It's disjointed. There's no one as serious as him. Let's put it that way. And so Benji always says that I'm the loneliest collector in the world. I have no one to talk dolls with. Now, see, he would be social. He likes the idea of being able to be around other doll people, but he doesn't travel that far out of the country anymore to areas around Asia. But again, some of those areas, there's no other collectors. And so he's left with this solitary confinement, if you will. That sounds so tragic, but I guess in a way it is the solitary confinement of collecting in the Philippines. So I started this ritual of pilgrimage to bring joy to Benji's life by going to Manila at least once a year and seeing him and helping him with his collection, working with him on display and cataloging and helping him see some areas that he might want to look towards in the future to add in to build a set profile of where he's going with this. And he loves it. And he's so happy. And we'll have dinner and he'll say, Stuart, it's the happiest thing when you come here because I finally get to talk dolls with somebody. I finally get to speak with somebody who understands and gets this and knows the subject. And this means so much to me. So you see, he wants to be social. He's just got no one to be social with. So if you're ever in Manila, let me know. Benji would love to meet you. And so that would be the last of the reasons. So what I hope you've taken from this is that it's not just that the person is introverted. It's not just that the person chooses refuge from the noise of the world. There are a lot of other factors that can play into the reasons why they choose quiet collecting. So I thought it would be interesting at this point to talk about some examples of quiet collectors that you now know about. They're quiet only to a certain point. And eventually, a lot of times, quiet collections and quiet collectors have vanished in thin air. I'm not making this up. The quiet collectors seem to disappear, stop buying, and years go by, and you realize that collection never came out. Where is that collection? What happened to it? There's no one to contact, no one to get to know, no one to figure out if it's still around, if it went to family members. You would think you would recognize things that would have been sold or passed through the marketplace, but you don't see any of them. And I'm always left with this intrigue of where the dolls are. We make a great podcast episode to talk about some of those collections that have vanished. But then I'd have to reveal the identities of these people, and I can't do that because they wanted to be private. But some of them, most of them, do eventually surface, and they usually surface after they pass away or they decide to move on from doll collecting or anything they collect and offer their collection on the market, and they have their name used, or in the case of some, don't have their name used, but have a very hidden profile of who the collector was. And they often call them, I love this, in Europe they do this, where a lot of collectors really choose privacy. They always refer to it as the collection of Madame X. It sounds so dramatic. And you can give a profile. The collector collected for 45 years, lived in Paris, blah, 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 was a patron of the arts and all of this, but no name. It's just Madame X. I've always loved this. I think we've done it a few times as well for some of our auctions where they chose the name Madame X as well. They didn't want their identity revealed. But a few really big names that created a huge stir did come out over the years. And the biggest one of all was Huguette Clark. And this one, everybody's instantly going to recognize it because it was a moment of epiphany for a lot of people, including us. Remember, I mentioned that there are some clients that we've had for years that we don't even know their identity. Huguette Clark was one. She was a client of ours for 40 years at Theriault. All we knew her as was the client. And that was what she was referred to by the attorney. There were 3 attorneys during that 40 years that represented her. He would simply say, I am calling up to give bids for the client. Under no circumstances did they ever reveal even a inkling of who this person was. So we were left in mystery, but that's okay. They always paid. They took the dolls. She would communicate through the attorneys occasionally about how happy she was with the piece, or I'm looking for this. Could you ever find one? And we would happily abide and do our best. So this happened, and we didn't realize that Huguette Clark was the most reclusive heiress in the world at this point, had really spent 50, 60 years of her life in complete isolation, either in her penthouse flat in New York City overlooking Central Park, or later on in a hospital room for a number of years where she just chose to live because she felt protected and isolated in there. She had a very small circle of 3 people who she trusted and who had contact with her, many of them on a daily basis, but that's it, 3 people. She had just decided she didn't want contact with any family members. She wanted to remain completely isolated and quiet from the world and enjoy her collections. And it wasn't just dolls. She had Renoirs, Monets, Stradivarius violins. She had the gamut. And during this time was our biggest client for decades at Theriault, and we never knew her name until she died. And in this case, a whole book came out about her life called Empty Mansions, and the intriguing story of the reclusive heiress who really did isolate herself from the world. And so in that process, we ended up selling her collection and seeing firsthand, the world got to see the dolls of Huguette Clark and realize what she focused on, what she loved, and obviously French dolls, which stemmed from her youth where she grew up in Paris when her father, Senator Clark, the great copper baron, had a residence. And so she grew up going to Onan Bleu and a number of the shops in the early 1900s. I mean, keep in mind, she died at 104 or 105, I think. So the last vestiges of the pre-World War I days of the French doll were her childhood, was her youth, and she collected out of nostalgia and continued to through her adult life. And so I always say this is the greatest story of a quiet collector probably ever told. And I encourage you to read the book Empty Mansions and learn more about Huguette Clark. There are other quiet collectors too, like Alice Avery in Brentwood, California. And I'll tell you this name and you'll probably go, it sounds familiar, but I'm not sure. Now, we ended up selling this collection, and she had been a very quiet collector and customer with us for a number of years. She lived in Brentwood, had a beautiful home there, and in the back had built basically, I guess you could call it a dollhouse. I mean, it was like a cottage that she turned into her dollhouse, and she would enjoy filling up all these different types of dolls. She loved Lenchies. She loved dollhouses. She loved miniatures. She loved German characters, the gamut. But Alice kept private, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, she was a private person, although she did have a very active circle of social friends in Southern California, but she was a profile name. If you're ever in Orange County and you're ever driving on Alicia Parkway, which I know many of you who live in Southern California will recognize right away, that was named for Alice Avery. Why? Her family owned pretty much all of that southern tier of Orange County around Irvine and I think Mission Viejo. They once owned almost the entire thing. It was a massive ranch and cattle ranch that they owned there for many, many years and eventually sold it and became one of the wealthiest families in Southern California. So there was obviously a caution in the approach to her collecting in that she kept very tight circles. She bought from Theriault, and we knew her identity, and I would go see her, and she had a few dealers that she was close to and a few doll collectors that she commingled with, but it was a very, very private affair with her collecting. And as she said, I would often just go back into my dollhouse, into that cottage that she built in the back and just reflect and enjoy her pieces in quiet harmony with them. So she's another great example. And then, of course, I always love talking about just this beautiful collector who is actually still alive and doing very well. But we recently, 2 years ago, sold her collection, but she had been a client of ours for some 40 years. And her name is Ruth Nivergelt. And, I would say a part of her private approach to collecting may be cultural in the sense that the Swiss, if you want to talk about privacy, the Swiss are the most private culture there is in the world, I would imagine. And so there was that natural tendency. I've visited Ruth many times, talked with her. They're wonderful social people, very humble, really sweet. And so it's just a natural extension, I think, of the Swiss personality. And I always love telling the story of Ruth that for years, she would fax her bids in to Theriault. She could call them in, but she chose not to. Even after email, it took her probably 9 years before she finally got email and decided she would email her bids. She never trusted it. She would walk to the post office in her town in Switzerland and walk like a mile, sometimes in the snow, to go to the only fax machine near her and send that fax to us with her bids. And I always loved that. I had not met Ruth, though we had communicated by letters. And for years, she would send old school handwritten letters to Florence, and Florence would type back letters to her. And she had this approach with having an identity with us and sharing a bit of her personality and her vision. But it wasn't only into her later years, just maybe 6-7 years ago, that she invited me to actually visit her. It took that long. It takes time in Europe to develop relationships with people where they feel comfortable in welcoming you into their home, sharing their collections. It's typical. It's very cultural, and for the Swiss, even more so. So it was an honor for me, and I feel in Europe, when you're invited into a home, this is an incredible honor. And it means there is trust, there's respect. So again, in Europe, I want to say private collectors tend to be more out of a cultural geographic. And Ruth Nivergelt is a perfect example. Another one is Hannah Buchtis of Vienna, who was very private. Now, Hannah had a profile. People knew her around Europe because she would go to auctions, she would go to shows, but she would not maintain what I would say robust socializing with other collectors out there. She would remain very private in these auctions, often accompanied by her husband. And she built, obviously, as you know, because we've sold the multitude of her many, many collections she developed over the years, and did it all in a very private manner. One of my favorite stories to display the idea of the privacy of European collectors and choosing the quiet path is that one of the auctions we did was selling Hannah Buchtis's dollhouses, doll room miniature settings. That was over 2 days and encompassed like 700 lots. It was massive. It took a massive container to get all of the pieces over because they were so large. One of the pieces was this Irish house that she had purchased in London some years before. It was called the Irish House. Beautiful piece, but it was big, as I said. So interestingly enough, we got it back to the U.S., got it to our offices, and then transported out to California where that auction was going to be held. Now, let me interject something. There is another collector who lives maybe 5 blocks away from where Hannah Buchtis lived when she was alive. And for years, I knew them both intimately. And for years, I said, you are both collectors. You are wonderful people. You have similar taste and vision. And why can't we put together a little lunch or dinner and have you? No. And the other collector, no. It's not my way. I don't really like people coming in and seeing my collection. It's very private for me. This is my collection. And so I was like, okay, respected that. And so the irony of this story and showing the funny things that occur sometimes in my work and my business is there's that house all the way out to California. And who buys it? The lady 4 blocks away from Hannah-Buktis. I could have walked it down the street with 3 guys in about 10 minutes and it would have been done. So we brought it all the way back to the offices in Maryland, shipped it all the way back to Vienna to 4 blocks away from where it originated from. So that's a downfall of private collecting, is missed opportunities that are right around the corner. So keep that in mind as well. The last example is one that's very poignant right now, is actually very timely in that we even named her catalog A Private Grace. And that is Marilyn Dornbush, Dr. Marilyn Dornbush, who is out of Atlanta. Now, Marilyn is the quintessential, what I called hybrid collector, in the sense that she was social. She did go to conventions. She did belong to a doll club. She did come to auctions. But it's so interesting for me because as we're selling Marilyn Dornbush's collection, they all ask, well, I don't think I ever really met her. Did I see her at auctions? And I'm like, yes, she was typically in the front row because she always bought small dolls. She wanted to be in the front row so she could really see them well. And I said she was there. She was there at most every major January event we had. Well, I just never met her. She is reserved in her approach to socializing with dolls. She kept a very tight circle of very close friends that she had in the doll world. Georgia Alarcon, a name you might remember, Estelle Johnston, that whole little Atlanta group of top-end collectors. I've talked about them in previous podcasts. And they kept this very, very tight circle of sharing within that group, and they would travel together to the conventions, but they didn't really socialize outside of that as much as the really social collector does. So they were a hybrid. So her collection has come as a surprise because I would say maybe 20 people in the world have ever actually seen her collection in person. And they're shocked when they see the quality and the quantity of this incredible vision of small dolls. Marilyn Dornbush, I think, blended both sides. She allowed herself the socializing part, but kept it tight. Now, I also don't want everyone to think that the only quiet collectors out there are doll collectors, because every single genre, every category of collectibles, and even of fine art has quiet collectors within their realm that many people never know, never heard of. And I got a couple examples because I find them absolutely fascinating stories that you can actually go online and read more about. My favorite one is the story of Herbert and Dorothy Vogel of New York City. They were civil servants, worked for, I believe, the city of New York or the state of New York. And they actually lived in a tiny rent-controlled Manhattan apartment. And if you know Manhattan apartments, they're pretty small. And yet they still managed to amass over 4 decades 4,000 works of minimalist and conceptual art. I mean, we're talking major pieces by Crystal, Sol LeWitt, Richard Tuttle. They were discovering a lot of these artists when they were young and buying up their pieces and gathering them in this little apartment. I'm trying to think of myself, where could you put 4,000 works of art in a tiny Manhattan apartment? But you know the saying, if you're a collector, you'll always find space for more. And they never sold a single piece. And they did this all on their limited budget. Eventually, towards the end of their life, all these 4,000 pieces, they donated to the National Gallery of Art. And the appraisal came in at literally hundreds of millions of dollars. They never lived above their 1-bedroom apartment. They lived modestly their entire collecting life. That is the consummate quiet collector. And what a story. And I encourage you to go read about them some more. There is a wiki profile, but as well, there's actually even a documentary that's been done. I believe it's even called Herbert and Dorothy, something along those lines, that you can delve into a little bit more about the remarkable life and the incredible collection and foresight that they had in building this in that tiny apartment. There's a story in the Netherlands about this Dutch collector. His name was Ad Palman, who very quietly, with nobody knowing it, accumulated 230 rare cars. So we're not, you talk about artwork, at least that's somewhat manageable in size. One person can carry it, but where do you hide 230 vehicles? He had a couple of warehouses, and then he even contracted a few local churches to stash them in a garage storage area that he had when he ran out of space in the warehouses. And they only came to light in the last few years and ended up going to auction in 2023. And nobody had ever known this man, known this collection, or known what he had accomplished. That is quiet. And then I love this recent story that I read, actually in the New York Times, if you want to dig it up. And it was just last year, of an incredible stash of sports memorabilia, primarily trading cards, that were discovered in a home by this very reclusive man in Virginia, as I said. We're not talking a few thousand. I think you'll have to go back and read the article, but I think there was 200,000 or 300,000 pieces in total that filled the house. And there was another collector on a lighter basis that lived a couple miles away. And when the collector passed away, the family contacted him because they saw some post on Facebook about baseball cards or something. And they said, can you help us? My father, my uncle, I don't know what the relation, passed away, and this house is just filled with stuff. So he went in and he bought the entire collection. Lo and behold, sight unseen. And it turns out it is a absolute motherlode of rare pieces dating back to early 1900s in the tobacco cards, worth millions and millions of dollars. That, in essence, is a pretty robust example of some of the quiet collectors, not only in dolls, but as we mentioned in the last few, of other genres as well, and gives you kind of a snapshot, a portrait of what these collectors are like in their time and what they're doing. And again, to reiterate that their passion, their love, their joy for the objects was still very much alive all through their collecting life. So what are the advantages to quiet collecting? Where are the benefits? The first one, I think, is the obvious, and I think a lot of people will identify with this in the memory of their own collecting as they are social with how it has affected them in what they collect. If you are a quiet collector, if you are private, you define your collection 100% solely without influence or any pressure. Your choice is based on one thing. I love that doll. Period. That's it. You don't have to worry about your best friend telling you, well, I love it too, don't bid on it. You don't have to have another friend say, I don't think it's that great. I don't particularly like it. You don't have another one saying, well, look at it. I think that finger looks like it's been repainted or something along those lines. No, you can look it over yourself, determine for yourself, and decide for yourself that you love it, and no one is going to stop you from buying it, and no one is ever going to really see it because you don't have people in your house looking at your dolls that's ever going to be critical of it. So you're going to spend your life loving that piece. So I'm sure that all of the social collectors listening to this right now have a story of some sort that they can relate to this, that, yeah, I wish I had been a quiet collector at certain times. I can see the benefit now. And I'll tell you exactly the scenario. You go to the auction and you have one of your friends give you an opinion on something, and you really love that doll, but they're kind of cynical about it or a little bit skeptical about certain things. And although be aware, it may be because they want that doll too. So got to throw that in. You got to watch that. But often it's just simply that they just are expressing their opinion. And there are some people with the confidence and the knowledge to just ignore it. But for a lot of people, especially if you're in that first decade of collecting and you're really developing your knowledge and ramping things up, it can really affect your choice in buying that. And I can tell you, every single collector out there who is in that social aspect and social scene will tell you stories about dolls that they wanted, a doll that they just coveted, and a friend said, you're crazy, don't do that, don't pay that much, it's not that great, you can do better, whatever. And I didn't buy it, and I never found another one like it. I never found one as good. And I regret that doll for the rest of my life. I mean, it can inspire you for sure on that quest to find it. I know one collector who collects Isaiah Walker dolls, and the whole sort of migration to her passion for Isaiah Walker originated out of this exact scenario. Now, keep in mind, at the time, she was really young. I think in the story she tells me she was 16 or 17 years old, and she was at a small country auction in Pennsylvania. And there was an Isana Walker that came up, and she really didn't know much about what it was or anything along those lines, but she just loved the face. She loved the look of it. She felt this connection that was almost spiritual to this doll. And in that, she bid on it. And she started bidding, and the woman next to her, a very established and proper doll collector, turned to her and said, "Young lady, you do not want that doll. Did you look at the arm? It's very, very worn." And so she was panicked, and so she stopped bidding. That doll has haunted her entire life. She has never found it, and she dreams of one day finding that exact piece because she can still in her mind's eye see that face and what it meant to her at that time. Now, she's more than made up for it. She has bought a multitude of other Isana Walkers, and so it's not as if she went Isana Walker list for the rest of her life, but there is that one piece that she just lives with, that memory, and she wants it so badly. Maybe, and I hope, and often think about the one day where that doll just turns up and finds its way home to her. So again, the advantage here, choosing your own path, and in that, never having anyone affect you or tell you what is good and what is not, because what is good to you may not be to another and vice versa. You choose for yourself. Okay, now, another advantage to quiet collecting. This is, again, a very simple, practical one, and it is actually correlates well to the previous episode when I talked about collecting in community. Because if you recall, I mentioned about what can actually be a detriment to a community you build, what can be a downfall, say, of a doll club, and that is drama. And drama can be the biggest killer of a group of really great like-minded collectors who belong to this club or belong to a little online group or whatever, and some drama occurs. Well, the advantage to the quiet collector, there's no noise. There's no drama. Unless you create it for yourself. But other than that, there's nothing out there. And if you are adverse to social media and stay off it and try not to let yourself be affected by it, or just don't go there, you live a very peaceful existence with your collection. And that's what I talked about, this communion with your secret garden. There's nothing negative whatsoever that will ever surround this attachment to your dolls. And that is really, I think, a beautiful thing in that sense. So keep in mind, the advantage they have is they'll never have the drama. They'll never have the friend getting mad at them because they bid against them on a doll. You know, it was so interesting. I've told this story before and I repeat myself, but not everybody listens to every episode. So I'll throw a few in here and there as we go along. But as auctions have changed so much over the years and people are preferring online bidding now, and a lot of it stems from the anonymity related to it, because the old days of the auctions when everybody with 300, 400, 500 people were in the room and everybody had connections and knew everybody else, there was drama all day of why did you bid against me and all of this. And it's fascinating to watch how on the internet bidding, you don't know who it is necessarily, rarely ever know who you're bidding against. You could be bidding against your best friend in the world. You could be bidding against your sister. One case, the lady was bidding against her husband, but we stopped that immediately and let them know because the husband was trying to get her a present. But it all happens out there. In this sense, I remember sitting with the woman in the South, and I went to visit her about 2 years ago. And this was after COVID, really. And prior to COVID, she had always come to the auctions, always been sitting in the crowd, loved attending, loved the energy, everything. COVID hit, she started developing the knowledge and the way to bid online. And she told me, because I asked her, why are you not coming to the auctions anymore? And she said, because I found the peace of bidding at home in private. The anonymity is wonderful. She said, it's really great when people can mind their own damn business. Excuse my language, but it was a valid point. She said, now I don't have friends yelling at me, people saying don't bid against me, all of these things. I just buy what I love and I do what I want, and nothing else is going to affect it. And so this has been a big driving push to online bidding and why people do it. As I've said before, you have people sitting in the crowd that are bidding on their tablets nowadays because they don't want anyone to see their hand raised up, and they can buy it quietly on there, even though they're sitting 10 feet away in person from me on the auctioneer's rostrum. Another advantage to quiet collecting is that you can create this sort of mystique around your persona that's really fun. It's great as people are all talking, who is this person? Who is that? And everybody will speculate, well, I think it's this person, or I think it's that person. And I always laugh because I see you posting things on social media about, I know who that is. And you usually don't. Trust me. And so it creates this air of talk and chatter that builds this mystique up to the point that it culminates in the end years later when we find out and that collection comes out, aha, now we know who it was. And that's really kind of fun. And it leads into people, I think, having even more desire and attachment to the object because of all this mystique that had been buried for so many years and finding out the owner. I mean, Huguette Clark is a perfect example. People were seeing dolls. My gosh, I bid against her on that doll. I can't believe it. And all the stories behind this now, and now I get another shot at it. I can bid. And this creates demand. And I don't think it's as good as I've talked about in a previous episode in branding yourself as a collector. That is where you can write articles, educate, maybe write a book, do podcasts, do YouTube videos, do anything whatsoever to brand yourself as a collector. I think there's far more powerful upsides to that, but there is an upside as well to the mystique that you can build for yourself. And then the final thing, talking about brand, you don't risk damaging your brand as a collector and that you get into disputes or drama surrounding your pursuits. Because you're being less personal, you can hold your thoughts and hold your ideas and not go out and share them all over Facebook and end up kind of alienating a segment of collectors who disagree with you, which is why I encourage, if you're in a community and say doll collectors, and you have the majority of your friends on your friend list are doll collectors, and your primary reason for Facebook or Instagram or any of these things is specifically to socialize with other like-minded people who are collectors, why are you posting political stuff? Why are you posting your opinion on whatever? Keep it to the subject. Keep it to where you're comfortable with and that brings you joy in your life. The minute it goes to that other side, you're always going to alienate a certain percentage of people. Whether you're right, whether you're wrong, doesn't matter. You're going to alienate a group. And that is destructive of your brand. So an advantage to quiet collecting, you're not really on social media. You really don't post your opinions. You have no risk of ever damaging the perception of your collection or your identity as a collector. And that's important because you are attached. Your identity and your being is attached to this collection. So keep that close, keep that protected, keep that safe. And with private collectors, it is just naturally that way. You go back and some of the names I mentioned, you have no idea of their politics. You have no idea of their religion or anything they believe in. And it was, as such, never an issue of anybody saying, oh, this person was that or this or whatever. No, it was just the beauty of their collection and the beauty of the life they lived with their dolls. And that's how it should be. Now, with advantages, there's always disadvantages. The one that's the most obvious, you miss the joy of friendship that can be built around the world. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because you heard it all in community and doll collecting that I did in the last podcast, that some of the greatest friendships of your life can be built through communities. If you are a quiet, private collector, you have no one to talk to. You have no one to share who is like-minded. You have no one to compare notes with or discuss different dolls. So that may be good in being able to build your own vision, but it ultimately, let's say, stunts your evolution as a collector. Things will move slower in your knowledge base and in your ability to recognize nuances and details. These are things that are developed over time through these friendships that you build. As well, just as I said before, the basic wonderful aspect of shared passion with neighbors and friends who become more than just doll collector friends. They become your best friends. And I realize for quiet collectors who may be more introverted, that is not necessarily a need in their life, and I respect that. But it is still a wonderful part of the collecting experience to be able to break bread, if you will, over the years. Another disadvantage is one I really just talked about during the advantage, and that is building a mystique is not as good as building a brand. And so, again, if you are that quiet collector, you have no recognition, you have no developed connection to other collectors. And at the time of, say, selling your collection, I think there's a joy to the mystique. There is that powerful process of mystique, but it's even more promising for you with your collection coming to sale if you've had a really good brand. If this doll came from this collection, wow, it's great. And she was a friend and she wrote all these articles and all these books. She was really knowledgeable. There's a level of validation and confidence in there. And so the private collector, there's going to be mystique, but there's going to be a lot of questions as to, well, did she really collect great things? What was her taste? Did she know what she was doing? And so this is a disadvantage in some cases, but that mystique, if you play it right, like Hannah Bouktis as an example, so much mystique around her collection. Huguette Clark, even Ruth Nivergelt, that everybody was like, who was this mysterious Swiss collector? And then they saw the dolls and said, my gosh, I recognize so many of these dolls from over the last 30 years. So that's powerful as well. Lastly, in all of this, and this may be one of the most important and I think will resonate with a lot of collectors, is these hidden collections, these quiet collectors, while they are doing it their way and enjoying their privacy with these items, they are removing them completely from exposure to other collectors in the education process. And I call this a loss to scholarship in a way that private collections removed from academic view, it can stall research in certain cases. If somebody is gathering all of the very rare dolls of a particular genre, and they've managed to accumulate a large percentage of them, and they are not shared, that ends up actually having a reverse effect in those dolls then start to lose identity within the consciousness of collectors, and as such, perhaps even lose market demand. As I've always said in other podcasts, if you got nothing to collect in that category, you're going to move on, which is one of the things I love about any of the national conventions, international conventions out there in doll collecting, and especially the area of the competition rooms, because people are bringing their things out of their collections, and they might even be somewhat quiet collectors. I know Marilyn Dornbush actually entered a lot of her dolls, though she was very private. She would enter them into competition, and doing so shared with others the amazing finds that she had around and educated people on, wow, I never knew that came in this size, or I never knew it came with this marking or with blue eyes or whatever. She did this prominently with all bisques and small dolls. So it was a great education tool where if they were completely held privately, think of the loss of knowledge in not being able to share with other collectors, and inspiring them as well to seek these types of dolls in their own collection. To end this episode, I pose a question for all of you to think about, ponder in your own collecting and your perceptions of collectors and collecting, that at its heart, isn't the relationship the most important primary relationship, that of between a person and an object? And does that relationship really require an audience to have value? Collecting can be very honest, I believe, if done entirely by itself. But it also can be beautiful if it's done on the stage, if it's shared with others. Either way works, whatever is the passion and the approach that you choose. But we take away from this that the next time you pass an unremarkable house, or you see an unassuming person at the auction, or a very quiet, reserved person walking through that antique show, you may actually be standing next to someone like Herbert and Dorothy Vogel, who are holding on to something truly extraordinary. The most remarkable collections in history aren't always in museums. Sometimes they can be in spare bedrooms and the hearts of people who never told a soul.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Theriault. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.